substantially cheaper. And industry doesn't tolerate their product getting cheaper if they have any choice. So we're trying to find sources of energy that are so much cheaper than fossil fuels that nobody will be able to avoid that stuff. And preferably forms of energy that the regulatory agencies that are usually captured by industry can't stop. And that's one of the nice things about cold fusion. While there is some risk in the physics, there's much less risk in regulatory, and there's much less risk in engineering than with hot fusion or with fission. So if we push on all of those three at the same time, something is going to hit pay dirt. And so that's our theory of change. And we also work on ocean conservation, because that is something that is sliding downhill fast enough that we can't just assume that fixing greenhouse gases is going to fix the ocean. So thanks.
Great. So I think most of us are here. So Kim, I think I broadly outlined in our email that we would have a set of questions to begin with, and then open the floor to whatever people feel they want to ask from that. And so typically our Let's Learn Something goes for 45 minutes, but a lot of times it actually goes over to the hour. So depending on people's availability. And so it's a little bit of free form too. So feel free to put out any thoughts that you think are important. And if there are really burning questions that are related to what we're talking about from the audience, please feel free to chime in as well. So with that, I'm gonna start with a quick introduction, and then jump into the questions. So
right, I've read the book Ministry for the Future, so that part we should be well prepared with the thoughts there.
Yes.
And
right.
Okay, great. So I think we have a very special guest today, Dr. Kim Stanley Robinson, and it's my honor to have him today on Let's Learn Something. So Dr. Robinson received his PhD in English from San Diego, has been teaching writing, and has been the author of over 20 novels. His most recent novel, The Ministry for the Future, discusses our climate crisis and proposes ideas on how we can solve this emergency. So Kim, first of all, I just want to thank you so much for tackling an amazingly challenging topic and shedding light onto some of the scientific, political, and financial complexities of solving this. And so as I read the book, and the rest, as you know, the rest of our team has also read it, it seemed like a thriller outside coming out from the UNFCCC's COP meetings. In fact, based on some discussions I've had with the climate scientists, it seems this scenario is actually quite optimistic that you described in the book. What motivated you to write this novel?
Well, thanks for that, Frank, and thanks, Carl. I like the sound of your Anthropocene Institute, and I've often been using the phrase the good Anthropocene, so that Anthropocene is not just a synonym for catastrophe or mass extinction event, but is actually, we are in the Anthropocene, but it can be a good Anthropocene if we do the right thing. So for Ministry for the Future, I've been writing utopian science fiction for at least 30 years and trying different angles on the problem. And with Ministry, I had two immediate stimuli. One of them was this feeling that was the news about the wet bulb temperatures leading to heat death by hyperthermia, that without a power grid in place, people would be killed by wet bulb 35 temperatures. And I wanted badly to get that news out there. It's a new limit case on how much we can let global warming go before we have rendered large swaths of the earth uninhabitable, no matter what our technological level is, especially if the power grids fail, which they tend to do when they're overstressed in situations exactly like that. Then you all have read the book, and thank you for that. You can see what I was up to. It's a kind of a best case scenario. I wanted to put everything I could into the mix as possible parts of the solution, which, as you saw, were principally financial and physical, with a whole lot of other factors involved. And since the book came out, I've discovered that it struck a nerve, or it fulfilled a hunger people had for a best case scenario. And I think that was because everybody's working on this problem. All the people who are working on this problem are aware that what they're doing isn't enough. But if what you're doing is regarded as a brick in a wall, and the wall does enough, then it can encourage you in your own work. And you can also begin to look at the shape of the wall and see where it might need more support, more bricks, more scaffolding, etc. I won't pursue that analogy too much further, but the response to the book has been off the scale compared to my otherwise perfectly fine career, but something has changed with this book. Maybe a magnitude scale, more readership, and especially by people, it's clear to me, they think they are already in some kind of ministry for the future. And so it spoke to them. And that's been a great thing to see. And it's continuing far longer than I thought it would. I thought COP26 would be the peak moment for the impacts of ministry for the future. That turns out not to be true. Basically a good thing. I'm trying to cope. And so that's how it all came about, and it's probably why I'm here now.
So your book is touches on some very complex topics, and even for people who are fairly well educated, it's quite hard to grasp all the concepts in one reading. At the same time, a lot of the characters that you describe are based on real characters. For example, Mary Murphy, I think, is probably a allusion to Mary Robinson. And I'm just curious, who is this book intended for? Is it more for the decision-making audience, or is it more for the lay audience, or both?
Well, immediately, I would say both. My whole career, I've been thinking that science fiction is a little bit esoteric, by which I mean inward looking and high bar, almost sometimes like a ghetto wall, separates science fiction from the general readership, which is why the general readership often rejects trying. And I never liked that. So all of my books are written for anybody who likes to read novels, and what Virginia Woolf called the common reader. And she did not mean to put anybody down by that. She meant people who were not professional literary critics need to also enjoy this book. One great example for you that's been a model since I was your age was Gabriel Garcia Marquez, 100 Years of Solitude. Now, that's one of the most sophisticated novels ever written. And if you try to imitate its structure and style, which I have in the past, you can't. It's that sophisticated and clever. On the other hand, everybody in Latin America who was literate read that book and enjoyed it for what it was telling them. That's the kind of double level that I would hope for as a goal. And so Ministry for the Future, I'm an English major. I write sentences that I can understand, and what I would trust is that anybody can understand them. There's nothing difficult to comprehend sentence by sentence in that book. Granted, the more background you have in certain fields, the more you'll get out of the text in the first run. But even on the first run, I would be going for the common reader. That's the basic answer for everybody.
So it seems you've been following the climate negotiations in great depth, and so as I think we discussed a little bit earlier, you were at the COP26. What have been some of the surprises that you've encountered as you talk with some of the experts in the climate field?
Well, there were a lot of them, and I'm going to focus on one that was truly surprising because it seems to relate to what Carl was telling me about the Anthropocene Institute. I met with and thoroughly enjoyed a nuclear power support group, which was a whole bunch of institutions and companies that were at COP26, partly to see each other and to brainstorm about how we can defend the idea that nuclear power is cleaner than carbon burning, and that we need energy. And even if it's a bridge technology to a better and cleaner technology later, we can't really give up on it right now because of the need for the energy that it provides without burning carbon. So I was always, I never had a strong opinion about this before because I am an English major, and I never found a compelling paper describing the advantages and disadvantages of nuclear and whether it had been bypassed by solar in terms of its need, etc. The main group there that organized this gathering of nuclear power supporters was involved in perhaps thorium-based nuclear power, with the idea of making one single model that could pass the regulatory hurdles and then would be covered by maybe the International Bureau of Standards or some such international agency saying, yes, this is safe in every context. And their idea was even to take over coal burning power plants and plug a small thorium reactor into those so that the plants were still working to create energy and all that infrastructure was saved, but the power was clean rather than dirty. Well, that surprised me. It struck me as an excellent idea. There was a guy from the United States State Department, a very high-ranking official whom I'd met before, and somebody, the leader of the Atlantic Council, one of the big think tanks in DC. And in general, it was a high level of support. Now, you've read my book, and maybe you've read enough about me to understand this. I'm an American leftist. I believe in the power of public over private. I'm an environmentalist. I believe the biosphere is crucial to human health and happiness. So, okay, I'm a green leftist environmentalist, a social democrat or democratic socialist. From that angle, someone needs to be saying, we still need nuclear power, that the critiques against it from the left and from the Greens are misguided at this point in history because of the overriding emergency that we're in. So I'm happy to do that. I'm a science fiction writer that known to be a little from Mars, and the angle from Mars is adequate to clarify to people that, okay, this is Robinson, he's got his point of view, but I have some standing now in the world as a science fiction writer. That's a specific public role. And in that, but also I'm known as an American leftist. I'm known as a green science fiction writer, as a eco fiction. I mean, climate fiction. These names by which people try to avoid the power of the words science fiction, which I will always stand behind as being the most powerful way to describe what I do. Nevertheless, I'm understood in the general culture as being a man of the left and as being an environmentalist. That means it's more important than ever that I support the kind of things that you're working on in terms of nuclear power. And I know nothing about cold fusion, and I've been to Lawrence Livermore and seen the hot fusion rooms, very exciting. Of course, these things need to be pursued. Of course, we need high tech to get us through this biosphere crisis. So I think I can play that role of making sure that people rethink things if they have knee-jerk responses that basically were formed in the early 1990s that haven't adjusted to the emergency.
Carl, do you want to share any comments or thoughts?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, I thought that the little chapter in Ministry of the Future where the submarine person was saying, geez, it worked for the submarine. Why doesn't it work everywhere? And a complete kiss off. But that is very much how we're dealing with nuclear. Yeah, it works fine, but let's do something else. And I share your background. I'm a leftist. I was an anti-nuclear activist in college when Ronald Reagan was scaring my pants off with the Peacekeeper missile that was only useful in a sneak attack on Russia. and couldn't be used for any kind of defense. And we were building those, and you know, full nuclear industry is a good idea. Although even I knew how many casualties being caused by coal. We have a website up now called nuclear.net, which is turning the thing around and giving credit to, and since assuming that it was a coal plant, and since a coal plant kills between 1 and 200 people per year, it's actually an open question to wonder whether the only really bad nuclear catastrophe was Chernobyl. If it had been an equal size coal-fired power plant making the same power for the same amount of time, would it have killed more people or less? And you can't answer that question quickly. You need to actually do some arithmetic. By the way, the numbers I'm talking about neglect climate change. It's only human health. And if you care about climate change, the nuclear advantage strongly accelerates. But then again, we're arguing about the nuclear power that was invented in the 60s, built in the 70s and 80s. And I always say never trust any technology over 50. It turns out that since we invented the transistor, there's probably lots of ways to make nuclear power that would meet today's economic and safety objectives. And in fact, the amount of physics we know today dwarfs the amount of physics that we had in the 1950s. So we're starting to be able to comprehend a lot of opportunities. And that's what, you know, we're trying to show light on. I think your book did a good job about talking about the tribalism and how different people see the same problem and how they act in their self-interest, and how maybe we can get different tribes, enough of them allied, and co-opt the rest to bring a solution forward. I loved that aspect of it, and that is one of the things that we're undertaking here. And one of the reasons I went full bore on nuclear is because my tribe of leftists is wrong on that one, and I'm better at talking to my tribe than I am at talking to the other tribe that are right on this. So, but we've funded public research, and we've shown that over the last 4 years, liberals and Democrats have joined Republicans in being majority in favor of nuclear power. So 4 years ago, it was like 40% of Democrats were in favor of nuclear power, and today it's 57%, which is fantastic. And then the Republicans have been consistently above 60% in favor. But if you propose, like what you're talking about with the thorium plants, and suggest that that's a real thing that we could have, then you get 75% approval from Democrats, Republicans, men, women, everybody. So if we build it, they will come.
Yes, thank you for that. And I want to add that when you mentioned the Navy, which is the chapter of my book that has made more than one group in the Pentagon happy, and I've been doing consultations there too. But the important thing to point out with the Navy's relationship to nuclear is how accident-free they have been, because they weren't trying to make a profit from it. It was a public good, and safety was priority, and it was engineered strongly for safety in a way that I think the Navy has much to offer the United States and the world in terms of this clean energy source. But also, I want to point out their wage ratio, which was another part of that chapter that people in the Pentagon appreciated, of 1 to 8 between the able seaman and the admiral. This has things, and this is a kind of a leftist thing, or public over private. This has lessons for all of us in how people will buy in. That if the public thinks that even the richest and most powerful person on the planet is only making 10 times as much as they are, and they're at adequacy, at that point, you've got solidarity across tribes in a way that you don't have right now. So in those two ways, the Navy, I think, is an exemplary organization. And I was happy to include that chapter. I'm realizing that Ministry for the Future, it's 106 chapters. I probably missed 3 or 4 absolutely crucial chapters. I probably added a couple chapters I should have left out entirely, because they cause more trouble than they clarify or help. But it's what I could do.
And you did it on scale. There's a quote that is attributed a whole bunch of people like Plato and Aristotle, which is, if I had more time, I would have written a shorter letter.
That's right. I wrote it in about 8 months in 2019. And I want to point out that 2019 was a darker time than now. It wasn't clear that Trump would not win again. And also, we hadn't had the pandemic slap us in the face. It looked like we were going to be slow on climate forever. So when you read the timeline in Ministry for the Future, and there's sentences like the 2030s were zombie years, well, that's not going to happen. It was 2019 that was the zombie year, and I was projecting it. And all of the things that I was talking about in Ministry for the Future happening over 30 years, they're going to happen in 5 to 10 years, and this is a good thing. So I'm considerably more hopeful than I was when I wrote this book, which some people called too optimistic. But what are you going to do?
Yeah, I hope that is true. I'm a little alarmed. Nothing destroys the climate faster than war, and war in Europe is pretty scary. And that particular war is being caused, I believe, by Germany deciding to turn off nuclear power plants and instead buy its energy supply from the world's richest man and most dangerous, most murderous kleptocrat. And it's not good, but fortunately, Germany has made a few steps, like turning off the Nord 2 pipeline plan for now.
Yes.
But really, the world needs to say, we're not buying anything from Russia until they stop with the expansion. And that includes aluminum, titanium, and all fossil fuels.
Right.
And Germany just needs to hand out an electric space heater to everybody who has gas heat and say, we don't need your gas anymore.
Well, yeah, thank you for that. I had the similar perception of this coming down, although you tracked it back one further step than I did in going to Germany closing their nuclear plants, which was a very short-sighted and silly thing to do since they buy their power from France, and that's nuclear power. So they did not escape nuclear simply by closing their own plants, and they needed them. And then they became dependent on Russia. I thought Putin was only threatening Ukraine in order to pressure Nord Stream 2 to open up. And now it's clear that wasn't the case. But I want to point out to you something that maybe the Anthropocene Institute can study after this talk going forward. This is post-Ministry for the Future stuff. The petrostates, of which Russia is one of the biggest and most dangerous, are in terrible trouble. They 60 to 80% of their government incomes come from their selling of fossil fuels, and they've got no replacement for that. Those fossil fuels need to stay in the ground. When they do stay in the ground, in order to save us from hothouse Earth, the petrostates are going down. And even if they're authoritarian kleptocrats, or if there's just an ordinary, rather admirable democracy like Australia, the loss of fossil fuel incomes means social services, teachers, airport controllers, police, and all of the things that keep society going, like social security, indeed. And without replacement for that, those governments are all looking at a short timeline to disaster, and without much in the way of alternatives. So I'm wondering if Putin, seeing that coming down, is thrashing in dismay, or if he's distracting his own people from the real problem that they face. I'm trying to do rational actor theory here. In other words, anything that happens on Earth, if you look at the decision makers, you have to assume they have rational motives first and discern what those were before you conclude that they're irrational or that they made a terrible blunder, etc. And as a rational actor, which I believe Putin is, this is a bad move, a mistake. And Biden's speech this morning was extremely powerful. Well done. And economic warfare is crushing. And America is the biggest economic power on earth by a long shot. And if the United States declares it's going to sanction you to death, that's a real thing. Iran knows this. And if Russia comes under the lash, and if the European Union and the rest of the world joins, then Russia has no one to look to but China. And China's not going to be happy saddled with an incompetent northern neighbor. They've got problems of their own. So, but to kind of wrap this up quickly, but it is today's news, it does come back to climate change and to energy. So things that you were focused on are causing wars already. This is not a science fiction scenario. This is not the year 2035. It's happening now because of exactly these energy questions. So I guess the thing I would love to have you study is how can we compensate the petrostates? That sounds weird saying it today, but think of Nigeria, think of Venezuela, think of South Africa, think of Mexico, think of Canada, Australia, United States, and also all of the Arab states, as messed up as they've been. We're talking billions of people that depend on burning fossil fuels to have their social security checks, to have their governments running at all. There needs to be a system of compensation that I've been thinking about this, and I'll just quickly say, it has to be amortized over time. It has to be fiat currency coming from central banks to be real and solid, like transferable to US dollars. It has to be a haircut. It has to be discounted and not full value. And lastly, it has to be entailed, so that if these petrostates get this money, they have to promise to spend it on clean energy first, and then keep their economies going by way of what people have called carbon quantitative easing, which is really to say decarbonization by way of quantitative easing. Now, quantitative easing is a scary thing to keep on employing, as we're seeing in our inflationary times. But on the other hand, some people are saying, no. If carbon was the currency that is being valued as the benchmark, the standard, like the gold standard, it could be quantitative tightening. And so people are beginning to look at the carbon coin. And what I've been trying to add to the discussion is, and also to stimulate further study, like groups like yours, is that somehow the petrostates are going to have to be taken off of their addiction and put onto a healthy lifestyle and diet, is what it's come down to.
So thank you so much for those thoughts. I just want to open the floor for questions. I think there's a lot to chew on here, but it's also quite interesting to see what other perspectives we may get from this aspect of compensation of the petrostates. Anyone have thoughts here?
I have a question. We were just talking about petrostates. What about a specifically coal state in West Virginia and having an inordinate amount of power in the legislative body? You know, we have to eat this every election cycle, and I understand democracy is a very, rough and tumble thing. But that inordinate amount of power coming from a perceived industry that has very little actual people that are participating in. I think Walmart is a larger employer than the coal industry in West Virginia at this point. What are some of your thoughts on how we can wean them off, right? Like within a democracy?
Well, thank you for that. I think that's somewhat of an accident of the balance of power in Congress right now. In other words, Manchin would not have that power if the Democratic Party had a 55-45 advantage in the Senate. So to make legislation work, and I totally believe in legislation as a huge force, you have to have a working majority, and it isn't quite a working political majority when one person can go off the reservation and leave a program that is even in his own best self-interest for his state. He could have demanded that the federal government give every West Virginian a job in clean energy and gotten it. The Biden administration would have loved to have had him on board, and presumably he was offered everything that was possible. He refused it because, in a way, the coal industry was offering him even more as a person, and he's chose himself over his state. This was a bad move on his part, and a bad faith people get into government more frequently than we would want. So the response to that has to be, we need a bigger working majority. And then it would be nice to get rid of these arcane and crazy rules in the Senate that allow a minority to, there should not be this supermajority requirement, or the the ability of people to clog it, a single person to clog a process even when they are on the losing side. This is archaic and it's not in the Constitution. The Senate should reform all those rules. And that would be, again, not possible unless you have a working political majority. I personally am impressed by the Biden administration's proactive attitude towards energy and the environment. They didn't have to go as far as they have. And indeed, of course, they're getting bogged down on it. But he's got a brain trust there. And I saw this guy in COP26, a pro-nuclear guy high in the State Department. The brain trust that Biden has pulled together is impressive. They're young, they're smart, they're well-educated, they're progressive, they are interested in getting things done, they're practical people. Even that isn't enough to overwhelm Congress sometimes, but it could have been worse. He could have gotten in and said, well, it was a squeaky victory and let's just play middle of the road here. Instead, it seems to me, he said, I'm going to be FDR now. Why not? I've gotten past all my obligations. I have a mixed career. Let's go out strong and see what we can do. It doesn't help. It doesn't help to have this situation in Ukraine, these world crises. We could find out tomorrow that President Xi has decided to take over Taiwan under the cover of the Ukraine invasion. Wouldn't be impossible. And so Biden has got other things on his plate that is making his environmental and energy program somewhat under threat. But I would say I give him an A+ for his first year of trying. Let's put it that way.
Thank you.
Any other comment? So, please go ahead.
Oh yeah. In particular, going back to the Ministry of Future book, my favorite chapters were the ones on Frank. So I was just wondering, like, what was your inspiration on Frank's point of view? I mean, especially of all the things he had to experience, like trying to find his purpose again by going to Children of the Kali, or kidnapping Mary and then forming a relationship there, which would continue to the sad part where he passes away, which that at least that was the sad part for me.
Well, thank you very much for that. I appreciate that a lot. I still think of Ministry for the Future as a novel about Mary and Frank, and then Vadim as the kind of shadow character. Like, what did he do? And what would I do if I were Vadim? The authorization of violence, you might say, or at least property destruction. But back to Mary and Frank, I was going to start with a heat wave disaster in India. Well, I'm an American suburban white man living in a comfortable town in a great climate, California. And I'm thinking, all right, why am I making this choice and how can I live it myself? So I wanted a young, naive American, which I can channel very easily, even now, to experience this, to be a viewpoint character that then my American readers could also experience. And also to say, I might not be able to write your ordinary Indian citizen. I've never been to India except for 8 hours in the airport in New Delhi. I have been to Nepal, and I've been to the Terai in Nepal and seen Nepali villages that are down on the plain. And that was a huge help to me. But I chose Frank for that reason of, let's put an American in this to be representative of a big readership for this book and put them through it. And then also what he goes through is wrecks his life, and it would. So post-traumatic stress disorder. I'm going to venture that we are all post-traumatic, because that's being human. Something happens along the way. When you're young, you can maybe by accident dodge it for a while, but then something's going to happen that's traumatic. But not everybody gets the stress disorder. And this is of interest. It doesn't work for Frank to escape his PTSD, although he tries. But it could be that he suffered some physical brain damage in the desiccation event that he survived just barely. And also, stress disorder is a matter of not being able to forget effectively, of being haunted in effect. And it's an interesting study to me because my family is post-traumatic and we have a little bit of the stress disorder. So it's a personal interest of mine. And I wanted to write about it because in climate change, we're all going to be post-traumatic in climate terms for sure, sooner or later, but usually sooner. And we need to come to terms with that as one of the affect states of our time. Can we still be effective in the world when we are post-traumatic? Well, yes. And Frank tries a lot. He does some good things. And indeed, kidnapping Mary and shouting in her face, as transgressive and inappropriate as that is, both in real terms and in narrative terms, I decided I was going to write it anyway. And that scene I still find explosive. I can't read it to public groups. It's too much for me. But maybe he did something there effective. And what I want to come to is Frank's trying to find something effective to do. Well, there are taxonomies that we call rhetoric. So rhetoric is the art of persuasion. And the ancient Greeks invented perhaps 50 or 60 technical terms for all of the ways that you can talk to people that will persuade them. This is what rhetoric is in its technical meaning. And as an English major, it's one of the few areas that I actually know well. But what I find missing is a rhetoric of actions. Like, instead of what you say, what do you do? Do you, like I considered and even ran a rehearsal on back in the 1990s, do you drive up into the Sierras and find a bulldozer and pour sugar into its gasoline tank? Do you, like the children of Kali in my novel, do you kill a rich oil executive in their sleep? Do you lie down in front of the tanks, like in Paris, in the Paris chapter? Different people, different philosophers and social scientists and ordinary people advocate different actions without much analysis. There's not a good rhetoric of actions. And when every historian looks at the question of why did certain social movements succeed? And we need to be looking at this, by the way, because we need to know how can we change people's behaviors fast enough to cope with climate change effectively. They argue about it tangentially, as we all do. In other words, they somewhat have their opinion ahead of time and they scour the historical record to provide support for their case. You see this clearly in Andreas Malm's How to Blow Up a Pipeline, which would be a good book to talk about. Another one that I love because I agreed with it in advance is called Why Civil Resistance Works by Erica Chenoweth. And her claim is similar to Bill McKibben's, that nonviolent resistance gets more results in the real world afterwards than violent resistance. And so she, like all historians, she somewhat cherry picks her examples here, but she makes a good case that needs to be heard and read. I just, by coincidence, yesterday, saw the CNN 4-part documentary on Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ, starting with the assassination of Kennedy and LBJ becoming president. And in 4 parts, it's called The Triumph and the Tragedy. The first 2 parts are about the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. And then the second 2 parts, which I haven't seen yet, I assume are the tragedy of getting sucked down into Vietnam. But the reason I bring it up is that LBJ got the voting right passed in collaboration with Martin Luther King. And they discussed what is exactly this rhetoric of action. What is the best set of things we can do right now so that essentially LBJ says to King, give me the power, do things that will show ordinary white Americans that you are under an unjust and even unconstitutional regime down there. And I will use that and transfer that into legislation. And these are recorded telephone conversations. This is not historians looking at it after the fact. They are, but they've got recorded telephone conversations that are in this documentary.
Not
And
by J. Edgar Hoover, I hope.
He was listening in for sure. Maybe he's the one that recorded them.
Could be.
Well, it makes sense. Either that or else the White House had already instituted a record everything important type call. Who knows? But it is impressive to see two powerful men with different kinds of power collaborate to get something done at the legislative level that ended up being nonviolent, except for this. Those poor people that marched in Selma took a hammering from the police deputies and the power that was beating on them. It only killed a couple people, but it injured a lot of people. And it was violence in its most naked form of billy clubs and bullets and then hoses. That suffering in front of the white American people seeing it on TV, I think this is where Bill McKibben of 350.org gets his point. There is something transformational about throwing yourself down in front of a tank and suffering for a good cause that you win over hearts and minds in a way that blowing up a pipeline or killing a person never will. So I'm very absorbed in this question of rhetoric of action. And I would say, to end this, Ministry for the Future is not good on this issue. It's a mess like history itself. It's not a teaching device. I missed some chapters that should have been on sabotage and compared it to murder. I missed some discussions such that you need to read Malm and Chenoweth and McKibben, and then ministry becomes like another case study, a mess that you can destrand perhaps, but it's not a guide to action.
Yeah, I guess I would have to throw in that my theory of change revolves heavily around the startup company and the Silicon Valley ecosystem, where engineers get so darn rich that they can fund the next great startup without having to ask politicians or bankers for permission. And that making a cheaper, better product changes the world in an organic way that no policy can.
Well, I would substitute organic. It changes it in a capitalist way. And that's good because we're in a global capitalist economy. I don't want to immediately, I'm not using capitalist as a derogatory term, although I often do that, I must admit. But in this case, private investment capital is crucial to getting through climate change successfully. It's an all hands on deck situation. And although a flattening of wealth in the world is a goal that is more long range and probably be good for us as a social species in the immediate present. I saw this in Glasgow very clearly. And the recent columns by Adam Tooze on asset management that explain the enormous power of asset management funds is the rallying of precisely this capital that you're talking about to good causes, to green causes. And it's still regulated and it's still a legal process. So it isn't quite organic, but it is working within the rules that encourage its success right now. And that's also important. So you're not cutting against the grain, but you're going with the flow. And there's a lot more private capital out there than even the central banks have because they don't keep much in reserve. China has 5 trillion. We have maybe 4. Russia is, I just heard this today in Biden's speech, is got like 1.5 trillion. This is in reserve. Private capital is sitting on 130 trillion. And you see that proves a couple things. We're in a capitalist world. We can't change that immediately. It would be nice to exert Thomas Piketty style progressive taxation on our whole world. But in the meantime, we can do that too. This is not an either or, this is a both and. While we've got these asset management funds, just today I read that an asset management fund offered to buy the biggest coal producing company in Australia for 20% more than its value. The company refused out of cold patriotism or sheer stubbornness or whatever. I would say even stupidity, but I don't know the details. But what would be interesting is that asset management fund, having bought that company, was going to green it faster than they themselves wanted to, and was going to decarbonize that coal industry by any means necessary. Well, this is, you don't have to wait for a working political majority. You don't have to, you can use the power of the immense power of immense capital to go to what needs to be done, because I believe that in the all hands on deck scenario, there are no villains. Rational actor theory would say that immediately. And then you can say, but wait a second, Putin, but wait a second, the president of that coal company. Probably they're not twirling their mustaches and thinking, aha, I'm going to wreck the world. You know, what fun. That kind of sociopath or psychopathic behavior is rare, and they are usually in political power or high-end companies. You have to imagine them all as rational actors and then try to see what's the rationality behind their action. See if you can channel that.
Thank you.
So do we have other questions from the audience?
I put one in the chat. I was gonna ask, what is incentivizing these huge capital actors to greenify things? Like if we're talking about like the changing hearts and minds as that kind of slower, like social agreement that yes, climate change is going to be negatively impacting people and we should do something about it, or seeing the suffering of people from like a civilian perspective changes people. But what about these kind of faceless asset management funds? Like what is, you know, there is something from BlackRock a few years ago, right, that said like if you don't include carbon mitigation or climate change perspective in your in the way that you deploy your funds to the people in their portfolio, then we're going to pull our funding from you. And that was huge, right? Because they're on the boards of or support or fund tons of different very large corporations. But that's like, yes, we have one person who said that. Like, what does it take for these big players who can move this capital much, much faster and have a lot more of it than public funding and government prescriptions? Like what does it take to make that more than maybe what Carl was saying about just like some engineers in Silicon Valley who are tired of having to ask the public sector?
Yeah, thank you for that, Kira. I'm thinking as you were asking, I saw a bunch of these people at COP26. And in fact, I sat down and started scamming on some leftover pizza on the table because I hadn't eaten all day. And the guy I was talking to said, "Oh, that's Larry Fink's pizza you're eating." And I was sitting in his chair. He had been the last one in that chair. And I would say that, again, rational actors. So there's two things going on here, and they're not disconnected either. One of them is financial. You can see the lay of the land. You can talk to your reinsurance agents, your insurance people and the reinsurance people and say, a greener world is healthier in a business sense, and we'll be able to make more money, and we won't have our entire clientele and biosphere wiped out, which would be very bad for business. So that's rational action. Then also, they're all well-educated people with values, and they have kids and grandkids, and they're thinking to themselves, you know what, I'm passing this whole thing along before too many years goes on here. I'll be dead. What kind of trajectory do we have here? And so Robert Heinlein, the great science fiction writer, a horrible old right-winger in his old age, but when he was young, he was called Crazy Bob Heinlein, and he was a utopian and a nudist and all kinds of, there were reasons he was called Crazy Bob Heinlein. And he said something that we're all very proud of in the science fiction community. Since you can't properly pay back the people who helped you, you have to pay it forward. So Pay It Forward is the name of a blood bank program run in science fiction conventions. And Pay It Forward has become, I think, a phrase in our culture. It doesn't have to be explained. And so asset, it's not quite faceless. It's these are powerful people, and their education in finance was deficient. They didn't get an ecology class. They didn't get a good history class. They didn't get a good political economy history either as to what the possibilities are out there. They took what they needed instrumentally for the work that they did, which was to make a lot of money manipulating money in Wall Street. They're portrayed in movies like Wall Street or in the early Michael Lewis books like Liar's Poker as gambling fools, men with too much testosterone and too much aggression in them. They wanted to dominate other men, and so they played with money as a way to do that. Well, hilariously, all men on this planet have about half as much sperm as their grandparents did. So the idea that you, as a rich person, you could go to a fortress mansion somewhere or buy an island or buy the South Island of New Zealand or whatever your plan is and get away and have enough money to guard yourself, you're still drinking water, you're still breathing air, you still need a food chain supply. You are still implicated in the world. And now I think that Wall Street, that's talking about the 1980s. Again, you don't want to get caught in attitudes from the 1980s, but think about 2022. And of course, there's going to be old school, cynical people, because that's true everywhere.
Yeah.
But what I'm seeing is, and also let me bring one last concept in. It's in the book, so I won't emphasize it. Ideology, an imaginary relationship to the real situation, that's powerful. And that ideology is quickly changing where climate change comes to the fore. And also structure of feeling, that in any given moment of historical time, the structure of feeling is specific to that time, and it structures our feelings. And now in 2022, all the asset managers are saying, well, geez, Larry Fink is green, and the people who wanted to buy that coal mine and that coal company in Australia is green. Greenness, is that the right way to go? And that's a new structure of feeling, because it used to be that greenness was a kind of thing of hippies did in the 70s, that to be green was to be Kermit the Frog and to, recycle your recyclables. Now it's an overriding emergency situation type formulation to how we can get out of this thing. And so we can encourage that. We can send thank you notes to the asset, because they're managing our assets, pension funds and health insurance plans, all those big collections of capital, like bigger than individual billionaires by far, are these pension funds and these governments. But the pension funds are being managed and invested. And since we are in a capitalist system, investing green and divesting from brown and from carbon industries that are wrecking us, and any kind of extraction that wrecks us, when it develops momentum, it's one of the ways in which you can say that Ministry for the Future is not only is it not too optimistic, but in some ways it's not optimistic enough. So I like thinking that sometimes.
Thank you.
So Kim, I think we're getting close to the hour here. First of all, I just want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk with our group and sharing some of your insights. So with that, we certainly would like to continue these conversations, but unfortunately we're out of time today. So in the meantime, yeah, we certainly want to discuss some of the other activities we're doing by email and see if there's other ways we could drive each other's messages. I think lastly, just to wrap this up, what are you most optimistic about these days?
Well, there's many things, but I'll bring up a topic because we're in California and you're the Anthropocene Institute. I met with the woman who's running California's 30 by 30 program. 30% of California conserved for wild creatures and being wild for biodiversity purposes. And the definition of this protected land is flexible and various, including some ranching land. 30% of California protected by 2030. And it's a formal California state program with a formal state office. So that's someone that you would love to talk to, because this is the good Anthropocene, where we have all of these, where we make sure we dodge the mass extinction event that we're very close to starting. And for sure, what I take to be your main focus, if we have clean energy, we can do so much. But we can also protect land starting right now so that the biodiversity situation the UN recently announced this last year, and it's something that ministry makes clear. There's a combination of climate change and biodiversity loss. They are the same crisis. What some people I've met call the poly crisis. So the poly crisis can become the good Anthropocene by a broad band of responses. So I'm really, the thing is, what I'll finish with is 30 by 30 is comes out of E.O. Wilson's Half Earth plan, which would have been 50% of the Earth's surface left to the wild animals. And when that book came out, it was totally utopian science fiction. And it was dismissed by readers. And everybody thought E.O. Wilson had gotten too old and lost his marbles. And now 15 years later, it is a government plan in the EU and in California. And I think UN is going to get it taken up worldwide. And that will be a tremendous advantage going forward. So that gives me huge hope that 30 by 30 is an active program.
Kim, thank you again so much for your time. It was really exciting talking with you.
Well, thank you, Frank. And thank you, everybody, for reading my book. I know it was a longie and a little bit of a slog, but I have other books that are more exciting in some ways. But
thanks. I'd like to chime in there that we. Yeah. And if you check out protectseas.net, you'll see our best contribution towards the 30 by 30 on a worldwide basis, where we've actually mapped how protected the oceans are. And that will help the United Nations get to its 30 by 30 goal for the oceans.
I love it. I love it. Thank you all. We'll stay in touch. I'll think of me as a resource, and I will be sending people to you. That's now my main role, is just networker, because that's what I can do. I'll send people your way as we go forward.
Okay, really appreciate
Thanks.
that. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Have a good
Thank you.
day.
Thank
Yes,
you.
thank you.